John Howard here. I'm presenting today one of my video op-eds on what I learned as a Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commissioner. Today, we know what to do. And I'm talking about conservation for species. The specific reason for today's missive is my reaction to the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBES, which got a lot of press coverage a few months ago. This UN-based evaluation confirmed what those of us who've worked in conservation since the 1980s know, that human development is having an enormous impact on species, causing increased extinction risks for many of them. And don't forget that not just animals, but also plants. Like most UN science project, it does a good job of evaluating and presenting to decision makers that overall state of the science. And it is indeed dire and calls for immediate action. The problem is this collection of bureaucrats and academics then go further. Quote, "The key element of more sustainable future policies is the evolution of global financial and economic systems to build a global sustainable economy, steering away from the current limited paradigm of economic growth." There follows on a list of policy choices that requires humans worldwide to live in smaller community-based housing, eat different food, abandon private transportation, and freedom of choice on how they want to live their lives. It is also treats the globe as one big morass of extinction, as opposed to a diverse mix of rich nations making progress and poorer nations starved for resources. Please, I thought you were serious about saving species. Look around the world today. Do you see an appetite for top-down reorganization of the economy, for the middle class and lower classes to lower their living standards directed by a super multinational organization? Ever heard of Brexit or Donald Trump? But let's be serious and give the scientists and academics credit. They have identified a serious problem and they are frustrated at our actions and how limited they are. I would say to all the traditional conservationists on both sides of the aisle, now that you see the UN's alternative, you better start resourcing the North American model. The model that earmarks funding for species recovery has an unrivaled track record of species recovery. We actually know what works. Saving species requires on-the-ground science by professionals and volunteers in the field, not in academia or UN conferences. The work happens in the field. It requires policymakers to actually fund those professionals and volunteers. And it requires policymakers to make funding decisions and implement them as if we were in a crisis. Not years, not months, but weeks and days. How do we know that that will work? Because it's working now. We have recovered and are recovering the wolf, the grizzly, the whooping crane, and a host of other species that don't make the press and the media coverage because, they're not an apex predator or otherwise iconic. In Colorado, we had almost no elk population in 1900. Now we have the largest herds in the world. We know what to do. We just aren't doing it. What we need is not Soviet or 1970s style British socialism, but rather a huge new resource commitment to fund the conservation agencies of the state and federal government. With that will quite properly be calls for reform, which I fully support. But I've just got a few minutes today, so tune in a few weeks for my observation on government reform around conservation. And where is that huge increase in funding going to come from? Where it always does. From economic growth. Don't let conservation go to the extremists. We don't need to wait for a socialist Valhalla before we get started, but we do have to get started. Thanks, and I'll see you next week.